On to the second of the two South region matchups, and one of the best matchups in the Sweet 16. One-seeded Houston, about a 4.5 point favorite. The 4 is juiced to -120, taking on 4-seeded Duke. Total of 134. We haven't touched on totals too much, Eric, so I'm curious what you make of that market, but my raw numbers have this closer to Houston -6. What about you?
So this one's much closer. I have Houston right now looking at this one by about 3.5. The over-under I have on this one is going to be 136 about is what I'm looking at for the over-under on this one. Intriguing matchup between the number 5 offense in the country, Duke, against the number 1 defense in Houston. It's going to be a little bit of a slowdown game. Houston 345th in pace. Duke is probably going to be in no hurry as well. They're 253rd in game pace. This is one of my futures that I was talking about. I've been waiting now for Houston to kind of, I think this is where Houston flamed out last year. If memory serves, this is where Houston got to this point. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, this is when they got bumped out last year. Really playing with fire. I had them losing at this point. I had Texas A&M winning this game against Houston. And unfortunately I kind of gave up on them. And all of a sudden they got right down to the end. And I was like, they're actually going to pull this off, and just credit to Houston, considering they had 3 guys fouling out. I think it ended up being 4 when Shed went, that they were actually able to overcome that. Granted, they had Shed for most of that second overtime, but just incredible effort by them to overcome what Texas A&M was able to do in regulation and draw even. But in this situation, I'm still leading toward Duke in this one. I have a future on Duke, and I will let that say that probably impacts my decision making a little bit, but I do believe that offense wins championships more than defense. I really like the ceiling of what Duke has to offer. I think that we were a consensus number 1 coming into the season for a lot of different people, more the eye test people than the analytics people. But I kind of lean towards that when the tournament comes around. As we've talked before, during the season, you see teams with high ceilings that don't reach those ceilings. But when they get to the under the lights of March Madness, they seem to find a different gear. And I think that Duke may very well hit that gear here against Houston. So I'm going to probably pick Duke to cover in this one.
You go back to the A&M Houston game. Maybe A&M deserved to win, although that was a double-digit game for the latter part of the second half, most of it. But A&M actually the first team since 1964 to shoot 45 free throws and lose. So if they shoot any better from the line, but they're also not a good free throw shooting team. So maybe take that point with a grain of salt. Duke beating Vermont and James Madison over the first couple rounds. The Dukes knocking off the aforementioned Wisconsin Badgers. I will never forgive Greg Gard and Whiskey for losing that game, and I will very likely never root for Wisconsin ever again. I'm sorry to say. Eric, but you mentioned Duke's efficiency when they're on. Miami against Houston last year. If Duke gets the Jaron McCain like we saw against James Madison, I'm not saying he has to shoot 8 of 11 from 3, but 40%-ish. Proctor, Filipowski, if Filipowski is spacing out Roberts, then maybe you have a chance. And Duke also has the guards to negate Houston's ball pressure to an extent. Maybe Juwan Roberts' shin is bothering him a little bit more than it was in the second half against Texas A&M. But I go back to Duke against Tennessee last year in the round of 32. Physicality really bothered the Blue Devils in that game, even if you want to give credit to Duke's offense and just saying offense wins championships, which is a fair notion depending on the matchup. Duke against Tennessee, they couldn't handle the ball's physical defense. I think the same storyline arises here. And then I know Houston wants to play at a slow tempo, but they do selectively run like we saw against A&M when Sharp hit some big threes in the second part of the second half, which didn't necessarily matter because A&M got to the overtime, but still, big-time shooter in transition. Duke's transition defense, when you look at how it's graded out against better competition, NC State, UNC, Wake Forest, Pitt, Baylor, even early season Arkansas when the expectations were high for the Razorbacks, they struggled. So I know some of the metrics say Duke has a good transition defense. I don't buy it when you face some of these superior teams in general. I think Houston advances here.
Yeah, furthermore, I think the concern that Duke's going to have as well is they only have 2 guys on the team who average more than 4 defensive rebounds a game. This is a Houston team that if the shots aren't falling, they have a means to get those second chances. They're 13th in the country in near proximity field goal percentage, 34th in potential points off of second chances, 37th in second chance conversion percentage. That's going to be an area of focus for Duke if they're going to win this game. They got to clean the defensive glass against Houston. But, that's the great thing about Houston is they can miss those shots. They're 77th in the country in three-point attempt rate, 59th in three-point percentage. Not bad, really good numbers, but they're number 1 in field goal attempt rate. They don't turn the ball over. They get the second chances. That's going to be a problem for Duke. Duke has got to find a way to minimize those chances for Houston.
And you go back to the Tennessee Duke game when you speak to offensive rebounds. Last year in the round of 32, Volunteers had 12 of them. So it's definitely a concern. I'm with you there. A lot of variables as to why Houston has an edge. But what are you picking here, and what do you side with against the number?
I'm still picking Duke on this one. I think that Duke has this. I'm picking offense over defense. I'm thinking that defense, eventually those defensive teams, in my opinion, they get to the point where the shots aren't falling. And if an offensive team like Duke, who has the capabilities to actually build a lead pretty quickly, can frustrate Houston, Houston can all of a sudden they find themselves scrambling to catch up, much like they did against Iowa State when they fell behind there. They kind of takes them out of their comfort zone a little bit. I think Duke has the higher ceiling here. I think that was the thing. Like I said, it comes back to the higher ceiling at this point in the year. Houston has a great ceiling, no doubt about it. But I think even with the loss, with the injury to Caleb Foster, I think, I still think that Duke has enough here that they can possibly get through to the next round.
Okay. First time we're going oppo here. I have that slight edge towards Houston against the number, and I do think the Cougars move on. But for your future's sake, since I have no futures on Houston, I hope Duke makes it to the Elite Eight at the least.